All right, let's crack on. So thank you for joining. Thank you for spending your time with us, and welcome to this penultimate Back to the Future series webinar. We're going to go to the next slide and just run through the agenda of everything we've covered. So we've covered a lot, and today we are joined by David Scrivens, who's an SE in our public sector team, and he's going to talk about IoT security and how it compares. Well, he's going to cover a little bit about why it's the killer, but also how it compares to NAC and how the different alternatives complement each other, honestly, and why we need to look at NAC not being enough. Next week, we're obviously going to wrap this series up with Julian, bringing it all together. And talk about how we build a zero trust strategy and policy, and trying to bring all these bits and pieces together to make it kind of make sense. As ever, please put your questions in the Q&A chat. We have an able body of panelists who like to be challenged. They like the tough questions, and I like to see them squirm. So please challenge these guys. Even
if they're questions from the previous sessions, that's even the harder ones. So go ahead and put your questions out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is being recorded, so this will be made available to everybody. We are in a backlog of standing up the hosting pages. So as we get through the backlog, we will get those out to you and make sure that you get access to all of these content. Hopefully by next week, we'll have that, and I will share the link with you all. All right, moving on to the next slide, please. We will be running the quiz again, so fingers crossed. As with everything, don't worry, with live children, demos, and quizzes is the moral of this webinar. But we will be running the quiz. Scan the QR code on your phone. You can join, you can participate. Usual rules apply, no Palo people, please, and join first name, last name. But without further ado, we will get onto the fun stuff because we have got a lot to cover today. So I'd like to introduce David, who's going to talk you through IoT security.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. So a little introduction to me. As Chris mentioned, I'm a Palo Alto Networks systems engineer in the public sector team here in the UK. Now, I've run a fair few number now of IoT evals and POCs, particularly in the medical space. We always get to see some very interesting things when we do run these with our customers. So IoT security, the silent killer. It's not necessarily the name that I personally would have chosen for this talk. However, given that Gartner has predicted that with OT devices in particular, they're very close to being weaponized by attackers to injure or kill humans. So maybe it's very pertinent after all. And on that note, I promise the tone of this will get a little bit lighter. So as Chris mentioned, question and answers, please put them in, and our colleagues will respond throughout. So let's quickly recap the past sort of 7 weeks. So if you joined from the very start in May, so we've heard all about App ID, advanced threat, advanced URL, DNS security, advanced wildfire, DLP, SaaS, and AIOps. Now it's the turn of IoT security. So today we'll talk a little bit about what the subscription does, how it works. I'll talk a little bit about zero trust with device ID without spoiling too much of next week, and how without a solution to provide context, enforcement, and visibility, IoT devices will bring an enterprise nothing but headaches and security holes. I've got a little bit of a demo towards the very end, so I have prayed to the demo gods, and hopefully you'll get to see the IoT security dashboard as well. So the challenges of securing IoT. Now, cyber attacks via IoT and OT devices are accelerating and impacting every vertical. So this statement absolutely speaks for itself. Please keep this in mind as I talk through today, and hopefully it will be apparent why that's the case, and more importantly, how you can overcome this challenge. So we'll start with a brief history lesson, sorry. So back in 1969 to 73, ARPANET, that was the first packet switch network, and that's when TCP/IP was born. Then in 1983, we had the official birth date of the internet, and that's when DNS was created. Then in 1989 to 91, Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web, which is not the same as the internet, although it's what many consider it to be. Then in 1999, Kevin Ashton coined the term IoT, or Internet of Things. Now, back then, he worked for Procter & Gamble. He was working on some RFID chips at the time, and he came up with the name specifically using the term internet so we could get executive buy-in on what he was working on. Then in 2000, a random stat I found, because it went with the meme, was that LG announced their first smart fridge. Then in 2007 to 2008, the first iPhone was launched, the App Store following after, and you could argue that that's changed the way that we consume content. Then in 2008, IoT devices exceeded the number of humans on Earth. Now, some notable attacks on IoT. So the first one is Stuxnet. So it's a notorious OT attack. Now, if you aren't familiar with this, please go and read about it via your favorite search engine. And depending on which historical account you read and where you like to get your news, it was a nation state targeting Iran's nuclear program, intending to stop them from enriching uranium, to stop them from making weapons. Now, my favorite iteration of this particular story is that a USB stick was thrown over a secure fence near an Iranian nuclear plant. A security guard found it, plugged it in to see what was on it, which, if true, is pretty crazy. Then we had WannaCry, which is obviously a very famous SMB protocol attack. It affected 80 out of the 236 NHS trusts, estimated to have cost the NHS around £92 million, which is a large number. Then we had SolarWinds Orion, which was a particularly notorious attack. US government, large companies such as Microsoft and Cisco were affected. And to this day, a lot of companies may never know if they were actually hit by this. But the nation state was most likely responsible. They managed to actually hack SolarWinds' own infrastructure to deliver malware in software update code, subsequently provided to global customers. Then we had the SEPA, or the Scottish Environment Protection Agency attack, large organised cybercrime, purely intent on disrupting public services and extorting public funds. Then we had Log4j not so long ago, vulnerability found in the Java login framework, allowed potential injection of Java code and exfiltration of data. Colonial Pipeline hack in the US, so directed attack at critical oil infrastructure. And then obviously last year we had the war in Ukraine. Now, our Unit 42 team saw the rise in cyber attacks actually started to rise before the invasion began in early last year. Now, the number of attacks that we see on their critical civilian infrastructure is obviously rising constantly. So remember this well when thinking about what IoT devices really are. They're usually or often just PCs running operating systems such as Windows or bespoke Linux, except they are running very old software and unpatched vulnerabilities. So there are an increasing number of IoT devices in all parts of our lives. You just have to think about all the smart technology we carry around with us every day. So in the home, we've got smart speakers, smart appliances, smart cars, and their smart chargers. But importantly, you think about what's happened in the past few years since COVID. We've also moved the enterprise into our home because we're working from home using corporate devices. In the office, we've got door system, cameras, printers, corporate laptops, etc. Then you look at the manufacturing industry, so sophisticated automated conveyor belts, handheld scanners, robotic delivery and logistics systems. And what about healthcare? So MRI, infusion pumps, drug dispensing machines, and so on. So a couple of figures and numbers to begin with. So by 2025, there are expected to be around 30 billion IoT connected devices globally. And a figure which I didn't quite believe myself, but I found it in various different places, is that 98% of all connected IoT device traffic is unencrypted. 57% of IoT devices are highly vulnerable, and 83% of connected devices run unsupported OS out of the box. Now, whilst all of those IoT devices are no doubt powering some very exciting use cases and innovations across lots of different industries, and they are no doubt driving business outcomes and operational efficiencies, but ultimately, how are enterprises going to secure that explosion of IoT devices? Now, because quite simply, it's that explosion in that adoption that has inadvertently expanded the attack surface, and that is exposing organizations to a wide range of IoT security risks. So why is that attack surface expanding and that risk exposure growing? Well, IoT devices are the weakest link of the network for attackers, with some 30% of enterprise devices being made up by IoT devices. So why are they inherently insecure? So ship vulnerabilities. Often we see out of the box, IoT devices run on unsupported operating systems, no ability to patch, and no visibility in a network of what and where those devices are. Then legacy protocols. So DICOM, for instance, which is used in medical IoT, it's a legacy protocol for medical imaging with well-known insecurities. So it's an easy attack vector to potentially inject malicious code or malware into a network. And we still see insecure SMB in use. Remember how much I said WannaCry costs the NHS. Then lateral attack vectors. So network segmentation with or without NAC is usually nice to have, or that there just isn't any. So this means no unmanaged device controls or simply IoT and IT assets exist within the same VLAN or network segment as all of the devices, and therefore outside of any east to west security controls to block lateral movement. So consider an internet connected IP camera with weak credentials and an easy exploitable known vulnerability, and you've got an easy route for an attacker into your estate. And once in, they can move laterally using those devices for C2, malware ingress, and data exfiltration points. Now, it's one of the security industry's favorite set of buzzwords, which is going to be covered in some depth next week. But what is the foundation of zero trust architecture, and how does that map particularly to IoT? Well, quite simply, never trust, always verify. That is the use case, or the case, sorry, for all users, all applications, but more importantly for what we're talking about today is with devices, and particularly IoT. So it's not enough to simply identify what a user or a device or an application is from an IP address. You need the context to know what the device is, or who the user was, or what application is being accessed and how it's being consumed. You need to know what should be accessed, and more importantly, what shouldn't be accessed. You need the intelligence in traffic analysis with machine learning to be able to identify and action on known, but more importantly, the unknown threats. So if approximately 80% of IoT devices can't use any kind of endpoint protection, without contextual segmentation, how do you enforce network traffic security for IoT device traffic, whether it's east to west or north to south? So the challenge of securing IoT devices absolutely requires a zero trust solution. So without visibility, you've got blind spots in your network. Without context, you've got limited means to understand where those blind spots exist and how to stop them without those zero trust security controls. And without continuous monitoring and automation or intelligence in your tooling, you've got no means to stop those blind spots from expanding and evolving, because attackers have themselves pivoted to using automation. So one huge challenge with IoT devices is who manages them and who knows what those devices are doing. Now, can NAC solve that particular problem? And well, ultimately, that problem is simply that NAC on its own cannot implement true zero trust segmentation. So NAC can't do true granular visibility. It requires lots of manual effort with disruption, and actual enforcement requires some significant investment with third-party integrations. Now, NAC might tell you a little bit about where those IoT devices are. Well, that is if you haven't had to turn off 802.1x on certain switch ports to get those IoT devices working. Now, given that NAC cannot provide that granular visibility, therefore without a fully fledged CMDB that is consistently accurate and dynamic, how do you know where and what those devices are? Now, endpoint and network security platforms by themselves cannot accurately identify all IoT devices or provide anywhere near enough context to security teams without that deeper intelligence. So quite simply, we know the problems and the challenges that IoT brings when it comes to securing an enterprise network. So think of logs and device identification and that contextual accuracy. So you might have a SIEM, you might send all of your firewall logs to it. So how does your SOC team gain the context and the ability to stitch events together? So what if 1, 2, 10, or 50 devices are all showing that same behavior? How do they identify what a device is from an IP address in the first place, and who owns and maintains it? For every enterprise that deploys NAC and keeps their CMDB fully updated, we know that there are plenty of others that are still using IP and asset spreadsheets. Speaking of which, gaps in tooling. So IoT devices are often unmanaged, and they are looked after by non-IT staff. So think of a medical IoT, for example. So who manages MRI or X-ray scanners? It usually falls to someone in radiography to pick up as an extra task, because maybe they like to play with PCs on the weekend. Now, most IoT devices can't use endpoint security, they can't be patched, they can't install a cert for PKA or NAC. So you need a growing MAC address bypass list. So think of printers in particular. Now, in a large enterprise, keeping track of that MAB is almost a full-time job by itself. And all of this usually leads to one place, which is a reliance on IP-based open security policy. Almost think of any, which is insecure and it is not zero trust. And then a lack of inspection. So maybe you have segmented your network into an IoT VLAN. Even better, if you've got Palo Alto Networks next-gen firewalls as your gateway, it's certainly a great start. But how are you controlling internet access to all of those devices? Are your controls IP or subnet based with wide open URL policies with no TLS decryption? So how would a SOC analyst understand the context behind a log for a compromised IoT device accessing what looks like a standard URL, but in actual fact is a C2 destination? Now, according to our 2022 Unit 42 incident response report, the average dwell time for detection of a ransomware threat actor in an enterprise network is 28 days. Now, that is the time taken undetected between their initial access and detonation of the malware. So really, it's no wonder why IoT devices are such a high value, easy target. So IoT security by Palo Alto Networks. So we'll talk a little bit about that now. So it's a cloud delivered security service, one of our subscriptions. So it's available for our next gen family of products, and it's also part of our Prisma SASE solution as well. It's custom built for the three main verticals, so enterprise IoT, medical IoT, and the industrial OT, all using machine learning for that IoT device identification, risk visibility, and automated zero trust security control. So pick the flavor that suits your requirement, because the three dashboards have a little bit of difference between them. So how does IoT security differentiate against NAC and CMDBs? Well, continuous discovery and assessment, identifying devices with machine learning and AI, and context through behavior heuristics. So automation of policy recommendation is based on that device behavior and that risk profile. And then how do we discover those devices? Well, again, it's all about that machine learning with device modeling. So we have a patented three-tier model, which allows us to identify 90% of all devices in the first 48 hours. Then we can do integrations with CMDBs for full dynamic records. And then we do device profiling to identify behavior and provide a risk score that lets you know how good or how bad your IoT devices really are. Now, with regards to IoT devices, NAC can help with enforcement, absolutely, but it should not be used solely for discovery. Inaccurate or partial attributes will only mislead security. So if you think of, I've got an example here, there's an HP device that NAC has spotted. With IoT security, we can actually get true visibility that is actually used in medical IoT as a DICOM imager. Now, if you recall, I said earlier that DICOM is an old legacy protocol used in medical imagery that we know has publicly known vulnerabilities and therefore an attack vector. Now, context is clearly key, and MAC address alone is only a fraction of the picture. So NAC and IoT security together is a much better integrated solution. So enforcement, dynamic, continuous automated identification, and rich analytics that provide that zero trust context. Now, if you recall what I said a little bit earlier about zero trust, so without visibility, you've got blind spots. Without context, you've got limited means to understand where those blind spots are and how you're going to stop them without those zero trust controls. And then without that continuous monitoring and automation, you've got no means to stop those blind spots from expanding and evolving. Now, with IoT and NAC together, you could identify an IoT device that is attempting to connect to C2 destinations, for instance, which we would identify with a combination of advanced threat, DNS security, and advanced URL filtering. We can then integrate with that NAC platform and quarantine that device from the network. Now, all of this whilst providing real context to the SOC as to why that quarantine has happened without any manual investigation. Then with CMDBs, we've got both a push and a pull model, so we can enrich device inventories with that real context. And then logs alone are not enough. So context and understanding in an alert is really key for a SOC analyst. So why waste time investigating what something was, what it was doing, and why it was doing if you can already enrich those logs with that context? And then understanding where a device is physically located is important. So knowing which switch port it's plugged into or what access point it's connected to is going to help IT teams when they're doing investigations. So yes, NAC can block unknown devices from connecting to a network, but with IoT devices, you've either turned their 802.1x off on ports or you're running a MAC address bypass list, all of which is an admin nightmare. So IoT security will restore that true visibility of what the device is and then tie it back to the underlying LAN infrastructure. So deploy an IoT security. A number of different flavors of this, but if you already have a Palo Alto Networks next-gen firewall or Prisma Access, IoT security is a subscription. If you don't have a Palo Alto Networks firewall where your IoT devices are, and you are looking at just IoT sensors, then we have solutions for that. Do you have our Cortex Data Lake firewall login service already? Well, if not, don't worry about it. We've got you covered because we've got a solution for that as well. But while CDL is fundamental to IoT security, irrespective of whatever subscription option you choose, for instance, the first option here on the page, it will stand up a CDL for you to send logs to, but there's going to be no log storage option available. It will just stream those logs to the IoT security service for analysts. Then with Prisma Access, we've got two ways of managing the service. So we have a panorama and a cloud management. However, only panorama with Prisma Access is supported by IoT security today, and Prisma Access uses CDL by default anyway. All of the optional third-party modules that I've spoken about, so integrations with NAC, CMDBs, NMS, etc., are available for all of those deployments. And then a very new feature we've released. So getting visibility into DHCP and ARP traffic is key to IoT device identification. So as a secure services edge platform, Prisma Access is not going to see layer 2 traffic and not all of the layer 3 logs, unless you have potentially a DHCP relay and you're pushing all of that traffic via the Prisma Access backbone, which is unlikely. But now you can use our Prisma SD-WAN ions. So at a site edge, and you can send those IoT logs, which includes the important DHCP, to IoT Security via Cortex Data Lake. Now, what if you can't route DHCP traffic via your firewall? Well, we now have a new feature released in PANOS 11.0, so we can now do DHCP Syslog listening. It has to be a firewall with the active IoT Security subscription, so you can forward that DHCP Syslog straight to the next-gen firewall. That will then wrap that up in what's called an EAL, which I'll cover in a bit. That will forward that to the login service, which will then stream that into IoT Security, where we'll start to get the IP to MAC bindings and the device visibility. Now, what if you have an air-gapped OT network? Well, with PANOS 11.01/H2 and later, we can now provide a secure telemetry data streaming architecture, which allows you to deliver next-gen firewall security telemetry data, such as those important EAL logs, to our security cloud services from air-gapped OT environments, and those are without the direct internet connection. So you need to be running some of our 4th-gen next-gen firewall hardware, so the PA1400s, 3400s. You can also use the fixed VMs of the 300, 500, and 700s, and you also need to have a web proxy license. But you can even cascade one or more telemetry gateways if required, as in this example, to get through that air-gapped network. Now, to close all this off, we offer lots of different sensor and multiple connectivity methods. So all logs need to be sent to CDL. So that includes the DAL, which are enhanced application logs. Now those are sent to the IoT security service. Enforcement, which is obviously more important than visibility, or as important as visibility, sorry, is done through policy recommendations. So device ID tags are created by IoT security, pushed back into Panorama, which you then can deploy to firewalls or to Prisma Access. Now, tap mode on its own will only provide visibility. You cannot do enforcement in policy. We also have something called ER-SPAN, which is effectively a remote GRE tunnel that you can bring span traffic back to the firewall. Now, it helps in situations where you're potentially looking at access and distribution switch layer deployments, where either physical span ports are at a premium, or you've got a remote switch somewhere where there's no IoT sensor. But it depends on the switch model and software support, of course. But the key point to take away is that you can mix and match connectivity on a single next-gen firewall to get maximum coverage. So use TAP with layer 3, for instance, and you'll get full visibility and also be able to do enforcement in security policy. So what is an EAL and how do I get them? Well, these are protocol-specific fields, and they enable us to do more threat hunting. So we can use them on our next-gen firewalls in conjunction with Cortex XDR for network traffic analysis, or with IoT security for device identification. They're the next level above what you would consider our standard traffic logs to be, which are using more than just deep packet inspection using app ID. That they're protocol-specific, and you get to see a lot more information. But critical is you can't actually see these logs in a firewall monitor tab. And I'll explain why shortly. But let's look at a real session to understand why we need EALs. So from a raw net flow perspective, we can see source IP port and then destination IP and port. Now, those who still work with old generation port and protocol firewalls will no doubt know what port 389 is used for, which is LDAP if you didn't. Now, if we didn't have the context or experience or Google, how would we know that? Well, obviously, App ID is your friend for those that are still working on those old port and protocol firewalls, as Nimesh covered in week 1. Now, when we wrap these with PANOS traffic logs, we can add some more context, but there's still not enough to really understand the full details of what's going on. But we can at least identify that port 389 isn't just LDAP, but it's Active Directory, and we can actually see who the user was in this case, because that'll most likely come from a user ID tag information that the firewall has. However, if you wrap EAL on that, you can now see the real NTLM user information and what the actual LDAP query was. So this opens up a load of use cases that we couldn't do otherwise. The real context is in the protocol details, not only that layer 4 metadata and app ID alone. So 98% of an iceberg is below the waterline. And ultimately, as the slide's trying to explain, is that all the good stuff is actually really in the EAL logs. Without the means to interpret it, you are missing all of that metadata and context. So here's a DHCP example, and just notice that those EALs as they come in from the firewalls are actually in RAW, but you can see why EALs are useful for IoT discovery. So MAC address, vendor, host name, FQD, etc. There's obviously parsing that needs to be done to make them useful. CDL takes those logs from the next-gen firewall, streams them to IoT security where that processing happens. And then how do we get those EALs and the logs to IoT? Well, we need to onboard the firewall to CDL. Now, we do this irrespective of the IoT license on the firewall. Prisma Access uses CDL anyway, so that's already taken care of. But if you recall on an earlier slide, we have IoT security with and without CDL. Now, the reason this is because some customers have no need for CDL for long-term data storage. However, we still need to get those logs to a CDL. So the process to onboard is the same for both flavors on the firewall. Difference being is that IoT without CDL uses a stream in CDL in the back end, doesn't hold any logs, you can't get any visibility into it. But the 3 steps or the 5 steps to get up to it are the same. Now notice in step 3, there's a ticked option for duplicate login. So EAL logs only go to Cortex Data Lake. They do not go to Panorama, so you don't have to waste any storage in Panorama to keep those EALs when you can't obviously see them. The final 2 steps, so you create your log forwarding profile, then you add them to your rules. Don't forget the DHCP rule because that's quite important. But you can, of course, use templates and device groups with Panorama or with the APIs to simplify much of those workflows. So let's talk a little bit about device ID, zero trust, and IoT. So securing IoT devices should be considered as part of an holistic zero trust strategy. So particularly when it comes to creating security policies. Now this requires IoT device visibility first and foremost to map that protect surface and inform your segmentation strategy. You then need least privileged access policies with dynamic device identification. You then need to leverage machine learning and behavioral insights to allow you to automate zero trust policy creation. And you need to eliminate misconfigurations and open door security policies, as I've covered earlier on. But you need to monitor, inspect, and verify device behavior consistently and continuously. So device ID. So single pass parallel architecture, or SP3, it's the key to the power of PAN-OS and our next gen firewall and SSE platform. So those who joined from the very start of this webinar series or are already familiar with PAN-OS. So you'll know about App ID, you'll know about User ID and Content ID. In PAN-OS 10.0, we introduced Device ID. Now that allows policies to be created that follows a device no matter where in the network it's connected. Now, enforcement based on device attributes such as an operating system version or a device type enables security teams to more strictly control the attack surface. So if you wrap our 4 key constructs together, you get least privilege zero trust policies. So device ID, so the IP device tags for IoT device identification and segmentation. Then we've got layer 7 app ID identification. So with around 5,000 applications native to the firewall, actually round about 1,000 or so of those are actually specific to OT, medical IoT, and IT specific protocols, which is important because context is key. We also have the ability to use our SaaS subscription to wrap SaaS application identification to over 50,000 applications with the application ID cloud engine that Sean talked about in week 2. Then we've got our security services, which have been covered previously. So wildfire threat prevention, URL, with TLS decryption, and DNS security, which allows us to block known and, more importantly, unknown threats. And then finally, user ID segmentation policy. Whilst foundational to zero trust, that of course is only really going to apply to corporate enterprise IT devices as opposed to unmanaged IoT because a user isn't logged onto them. Now, device ID allows administrators to more granularly control the attack surface. So in this example, I've got a device object which is defined using only the operating system. So this device object is going to match any device that's running Windows 7 Professional. So since the risk in this case is an outdated operating system on a sales kiosk. Now, the administrator can pair that with tailored security profiles to more tightly limit risk. So in this example, we've got a file blocking profile which disallows risky file types. That's applied to the rule used by Windows 7 devices. Decryption is obviously key in this example to be able to get access to a payload encrypted traffic, but the good thing about most IoT internet traffic is it's usually not encrypted. And then segmentation. So in PAN-OS, we can segment with the fundamental building blocks of zones, attached interfaces, and use virtual routers. We can also do virtual systems for full logical configuration and tenant segregation. Now, with my example, I've used zones to simply segment kiosk traffic from their source zone internal to the internet zone for external traffic. Now, if I left the default rules as they were in PAN-OS, traffic from the internet to the kiosk would be blocked due to that final interzone default deny rule. However, what about other devices in that same zone internal segment talking to that particular kiosk? Well, that would not get blocked due to the penultimate default rule of intrazone default, which would allow, and importantly, again, due to those default settings, it would not log the traffic. So remember, with zero trust, log all traffic, only allow the traffic explicitly required, and always follow our best practice recommendations, such as utilizing zone protections. So ultimately, build micro perimeters within your IoT estate. So that's more commonly known as micro segmentation. Then within your segments, make sure you've got full visibility into all connectivity to and from your data, applications, assets, and services. So how does IoT security pull all of these foundations together with our next-gen firewalls and Prisma SASE, which allows us to automate zero trust policy? Well, firstly, IoT security uses machine learning. It creates the baseline of devices' behavior using the enhanced application log traffic analysis and all of the crowdsourced data we have. IoT security constantly checks for deviations to that baseline, and it alerts as necessary. Secondly, IoT security creates the policy recommendation, and with one click, it will synchronize with Panorama, so particularly for Prisma Access, or you can just send it to next-gen firewalls with the IoT subscription in your enterprise. And then thirdly, device-specific device ID tags will be created on the next-gen firewall, and that allows your baseline NAP IDs and allows our CDS services and zones to be used for segmentation, so consistent continuous inspection and verification. So in summary, security services that use global scale threat intelligence and security services underpinned by machine learning and AI are the only way defenders can stop attackers that are using automation themselves, particularly with IoT, because the attack surface is far greater than a lockdown corporate laptop. You need platforms that are flexible in deployment and not only give you visibility, but the ability to enforce segmentation, but more importantly, least privileged zero trust policies. So the path to securing IoT, IT, and OT devices with a zero trust approach. So know your IoT assets and their risks. Don't rely on incomplete tooling. Always enforce least privileged access and segment your network. Monitor device behaviors continuously to verify and inspect, because NAC alone is not enough. And then finally, automate and simplify your operations and workflows. Now, I am going to move to a demo. So if you give me 2 seconds while I get that set up. Right, okay, so I have a firewall instance, and I also have one of our IoT security demo dashboards. So this one is geared towards enterprise IoT rather than medical or industrial. So when you log in, this is the dashboard that you'll see. And I did pray to the demo gods, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be. There we go, it's loaded. So when you first log in, it's going to tell you the total number of devices that the IoT security dashboard has picked up through the various logs that we forwarded up. You're going to see a breakdown of what those devices are through consumer IoT, traditional IT, etc. It's going to tell you which sites you've got onboarded in terms of firewalls and Prisma Access and those that are picking devices up. It'll start to let you know what applications we've seen, the various network segments that we're picking up. It'll give you a risk overview in terms of the number of alerts and which devices are the top ones to investigate. It'll break down into specific vulnerabilities that we've seen and where we've actually tied devices to those vulnerabilities. And then it will also look at things like top vulnerabilities in the particular vertical that we're looking at. And you can also then tie those CVEs, for instance, back to which of those vulnerable instances that you've got. Then we can move to the security dashboard. So this is going to give a bit more specific view. So I'll tell you, for instance, how many devices you've got IoT that are already running unsupported OSs. It'll tell you 56, for instance here, risky devices with internet connections. There's 3 critical, and I'll come to that in a second. It'll even tell you those with weak credentials, i.e. we've seen where there's weak standard credentials out of the box. And it'll also tell you the various alert distributions, etc. Now, if I move to the list of assets, and sort of drill into one of these particular IoT devices. So if I go into the access communications network, which when it loads will be an IP security surveillance camera. And what this page is going to do, it's going to show a risk score, and it's also going to show something called a confidence score. So the higher the risk, obviously, the worse that device is. Now, the confidence score, so the higher that confidence score, so in this case, that confidence score, as you can see here, is 100. What that means is that all the telemetry data that we've seen for this particular device, that we've tied that back to all that machine learning and that AI, and we can say with 100% confidence that it is an access communications network camera, and the risks that we're seeing are real, and we've seen them out in the real world. It'll also tell you, for instance, the various versions of SMB that we've seen, and given what I mentioned earlier on with regards to WannaCry, obviously version 1, etc., very old. You can also see the connected switch that this is connected to, the switch IP, and it's on a PO1, so it's probably an access port connected into distribution. But as I mentioned, this helps you identify where devices are. What it's going to do is give you a breakdown of the bad stuff that we're seeing on this particular device. So the network behaviors, so we can see that the software, for instance, is not good on this. We can see some bad stuff is going on the internet. And then if we scroll down, we can see some particular alerts. So we can see, for instance, that there's some HTTP brute force attempts up to this particular device. We can see that this device is actually talking out to a malware destination on the internet. So that, for me, would ring some alarm bells, and I'd be instantly looking to do something about that. So from here, we can actually click on the action, and we can actually quarantine that straight into Cisco ISE, and then send the alert into our SIEM to say something bad has happened. And then we can also look down, and you'll see things like the various vulnerabilities that we've also picked up. So this one is also actually saying there, SMB version 1. Again, it's about wrapping security around this. So if we look at profiles, so all the devices that we pick up in the dashboard will get profiled. Now, what that profile will look like, so again, if I click on Access, what that's going to do, that's going to look at the various applications that we've seen locally, and applications that we haven't actually seen. So this comes from our machine learning and the crowdsourcing that we've got that tell us how these devices should be behaving. Again, we can see the various alerts that we've seen, the vulnerabilities that we know affect these particular devices, and which of those particular instances are affected by those CVEs. But if we click on behaviors, that's going to tell us what applications we've seen, both from an outbound and an inbound perspective. And then we can actually look at the policy. So this will automatically create what's called a policy set for you, or you can create the first one. What that's going to do is that's going to wrap all of those applications together into a policy set. Now, if there are any changes to that policy set, i.e. some new behaviors have seen since you last set an active one, it'll actually come up on the page and it'll tell you that there's been some new behaviors that have seen. Now, that might be that it's some new changes that have been done via the vendor themselves, or it could actually be that something bad has happened, it's been picked up, and then you need to do some analysis on that. So if we click into that policy set, that's going to show us that there's 18 applications that we've seen for this particular device. We can see that it's synced with a Palo Alto Networks next-gen firewall. So what that means is that policy set has actually been sent down to our firewall with the IoT Security subscription. So if I quickly move across to our firewall, under the device tab, you can see under the policy recommendation and under the IoT, you can see the various policy rules that have been sent down for access. Now, to actually push this into your firewall and make it live policy, put a tick against one, and then you would do import policy rules. So if I quickly move to policies and look at access, you can see that these are live policy rules, and these are the applications that have been onboarded to the firewall. The device here, so that will be any device that is an access communication networks CAM, and what that means is those firewalls or Prisma Access, wherever these rules go to, will have that device to IP tag, which will be in this database, and any of those devices will get picked up here. Then you can start to add your security profiles. You can even start to segment that if you choose to. So that's the end of the demo. And with that, I am going to hand back to Chris.
Hey, so David, one of the things I noticed that I know, some of the companies that you and I talk to say, well, I use a scanner to identify where all my devices are. Maybe they do that once a month. So this is something that gives you real-time visibility into every single device. And it also looks like it's continuous. And then instead of 100,000 more problems, I think it's giving you solutions for where to prioritize. And then the fact that it goes a step further and behaviorally it'll go, hey, this security camera over here, that's not good. Here's where you identify. This is starting to give you solutions, right? Am I kind of summing that up about right?
Exactly. So the way to look at it is yes, it's another dashboard to look at. But if you think of historically, everyone's just piled IoT devices in, no visibility of where they are. So what this gives you is the ability to get visibility. So for instance, as you mentioned, you can look at where the top alerts, the top vulnerabilities are. But if you look actually into the alerts themselves, so if we go to security alerts, you can actually see where the critical alerts actually are. So they're obviously the ones.
So there's the prioritization. Here's where I'm going to start.
Yeah. So things like SCADA, password crack, and brute force, anything like that, or obviously access to a flagged internet site, which is going to be a malware destination. These are things which an enterprise needs to be looking at, because as soon as a command and control happens, as soon as that lateral movement happens, and as I mentioned, that dwell time, to be honest with you, it's usually game over. And that's where malware and that's where all the bad stuff happens.
And that's where you get the protection from the Palo Alto solution, the advanced threat prevention, the advanced wildfire, advanced URL filtering, if there's a beacon out, and it kind of all comes together, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's taken what is visibility, which is an easy thing with IoT in truth, with multiple tools, but it's about taking that visibility to the next step. So it's enforcement. So it's wrapping that back into one of our next gen firewalls or an IoT sensor, but being able to wrap that policy around it, being able to do advanced threat prevention, advanced wildfire, advanced URL and DNS. So really locking down what those devices are doing and building that least privileged access policy, because as I mentioned many times through this, getting context of what your devices are doing is important. It's critical, because if you aren't doing that, you're opening yourself up to some bad stuff happening.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like SMB v1. I love Ned Pyle at Microsoft, the guy that created SMB. His statement is, for the love of God, stop using SMB. But for those companies that have to, that's great to then segment it so nothing can come in and nothing can go out, exactly like the WannaCry situation you talked about. So
yeah, indeed.
Beautiful.
All right.
Awesome. David.
All right, I'll hand that to you, Chris.
One question. So obviously what we talked about here is a camera, right? But obviously medical IoT and industrial IoT are different. So I don't know if you want to just talk about the differences between what we showed today and what would exist in that.
So with medical IoT, so the dashboard looks very similar. The idea being is obviously getting visibility, but with the medical flavor of this, what you get is the ability to, there's a cool feature in there, for instance, with MRI scanners and CT scanners, it will actually show you visibility of what body parts are being scanned on particular devices. So the reason that that's in there is so if you've got a hospital that's busy, for instance, and you might have, I don't know, an ultrasound machine that's sat in a ward somewhere that's not being used, it means that operational teams within a medical space can identify where their devices are. They can find the ones that aren't being used, then move them around and obviously get visibility into that. With industrial OT, that's when we can start looking at the SCADA and the lots of certification that come with it, industry IoT. And obviously I mentioned before, we've now got that ability to look at air-gapped OT networks and how we can help customers that have got some very locked down networks get true visibility, but the ability to enforce and make sure that their critical OT networks are secure. And given back to what I mentioned at the very start, is those growing attacks at critical infrastructure, the growing potential for OT devices. An example I've got on that actually is if you remember back, it must be in March, there was an ethical hacking competition in Canada. And a group were able to hack into a Tesla Model 3. So Tesla did put the car into the competition. They were able to gain access to the remote lock-in of that car. That is potentially while that car was in motion. So you think about, or if you extrapolate that out to, let's say, automated logistics, delivery drones and things like that, if those devices are potentially hackable, think about the danger to life and what that could mean to everything, I suppose. So yeah, industry OT is obviously one of the most critical parts of the business, well, in the world, I guess, and being able to wrap that policy around and get real visibility, it's more critical than ever.
And like you said, one of the things of just how naturally App ID goes for an OT environment, right? Those 1,000 App ID protocols. So if you have a Siemens Step 7 controller, you could say policies to read this state, but not write and make changes to that. So not only can you isolate it for kind of normal Windows stuff, but you can, get to the granular level that's required, and it really goes hand in hand in building that true zero trust security policy in the OT layer.
Exactly, and that's where those EALs come in, because we get that really deep level intelligence of what's going on at the protocol level, not just at the App ID and layer 3 and 4.
I'm glad the enhanced application logs are exactly why Cortex XDR plus our firewalls. I love the use case that you showed, but this is why the SOC teams really can stitch in any enterprise event, any event of network data plus the endpoint data to really understand what's going on in the environment. Because again, we've enhanced 20 or 30 protocols. Again, I worked on this years ago to add additional things that the network analyst needs to really understand, instead of porting an IP address and some flow data.
Yep.
Okay.
All right.
Superb. So thank you,
Chris.
David. And I will just quickly share my screen. We'll wrap up the usual wrap up so everybody knows the flow from here. So we always have a call to action. So everybody, can you see my screen?
You're up and good.
Cool. So yeah, brilliant. Look, David, it's been an amazing trip through. We've covered a lot of content, and it nicely tees up the next week's session as well. Talk about zero trust. So thank you so much for that. Obviously, for call to actions, we've got a few today. So obviously, we've had a little demo. If you want, you can request a demo through our portal. Just scan the QR code and you can go register and somebody will be in touch. You can also use the survey at the end of the presentation or the end of the webinar, and you can request sales to get in touch as well. There is a trial. So if you're an existing Palo Alto customer, you can enable this trial. Just scan the QR code, follow the instructions, and then use David's 5 steps to go and enable this on your devices. And just for a bit of education, our Unit 42 team have released an enterprise buyer's guide to IoT security. So Unit 42, if you're not aware, is our consulting arm. They act and deliver kind of independent content, and it's not all geared around Palo Alto. So there's an independent voice within that. Obviously, we can deploy technology, so we can do security lifecycle review, and we can put this in tap mode, and we can show you what IoT, for example, we can see on your network, and we can start to give you some visibility into not just the IoT, but also the threats and the content traversing your network. A super powerful tool. I know, John, you're passionate about this.
I just did a review with a CISO who couldn't believe that they had 52 remote access applications. They had 32 file sharing applications. They had 20 proxy applications in their network, plus some Cobalt Strike and a couple thousand malicious DNS queries leaving their network. So definitely help give them a little lack of confidence in their existing security controls, and that's where we could work with them on this. So definitely 100%. a great call out.
And obviously, John posted in the chat a paper on detecting evasive command and control, and particularly Cobalt Strike. If you want to go deep on IoT security, obviously, without getting your hands dirty, you can go to our Beacon Learning portal. There is a lot of content there that can help you upskill yourself on a lot of the theory of the technology and how it works and how to deploy, etc. So go sign up. There's loads of content there. And obviously, should you have any questions, you can follow up with the account teams. All right. Obviously, we have the survey. Please complete the survey. Your feedback is a gift. We are amending these sessions live based upon your feedback. So hopefully we're getting more demos in that I think most of you have requested at different times. Also in the autumn, we're going to come back with Back to the Future 2, where we'll take your feedback from these sessions and probably restream some of this content, but also create some new content to support that. If you want sales or SEs to get in contact with you and talk about this in more detail, about IoT security specifically, then please let us know. So that brings us to next week. So next week, we have Julian, who's going to cover off the building zero trust policy. So we're going to bring it all together, building a lot on what David talks about today around how we do zero trust for IoT, but we're going to go detailed on zero trust, starting with principles and building from there. We also have a ZTNA workshop being planned for the 11th of July. I will provide a QR code for that next week. But taking those two things in conjunction will help you build a zero trust capability and competence, and then ZTNA will look at how we deploy zero trust in SASE. Okay, then, so game time. We are on to the quiz, and obviously, first things first, we need to announce last week's winners. So last week's quiz was a good one. It was quite a tight-fought affair, but without further ado, and in the interest of time, in third place we had Urban Limburg. Cracking result, actually.
All right.
Kind of came out of nowhere, Urban. So great set of results. You shot up the leaderboard towards the end. In second place was Casper Lalek. So Casper, congratulations. I mullered your name last week, and apologies for that. I looked it up as soon as I'd read it. So hopefully I got it right this week. But congratulations, you came second. And then in first place, we had Tobias Knoll. Not much between you two, 2 points. So it was super tight at the top. It was really tight. So Tobias must have just been fractionally quicker. But congratulations to you three, our winners for the quiz last week. So as normal, you three will receive an email like this. If you are not a winner, then it is probably phishing. If you are a winner, congratulations. Click on the link and go claim your gift. All right. Only one more of these. Okay. So the quiz. So scan the QR code, get yourself registered and into the quiz. Please join with your first name, last name, so we can find you. And then obviously we can email you with your prizes should you be a lucky winner. Palo people, please do not join the quiz. Please, it makes it so hard in the back end to fix it. But by all means, Palo people, if you're interested, we can run these quizzes for you. So, okay, with that, I will just quickly stop sharing and I will load up the quiz proper.
And yeah, so looks like Capture Lilac is on. So, yeah, by 2 points. So it's great to see some of the same folks here again. So definitely some good questions and not the same winners every week. This is good.
Okay.
Even I keep learning a couple things. This is good.
Okay. Right, fingers crossed this is going to work. I have my wonderful assistant Stefania in backup if this doesn't work, but it has been notoriously unreliable for me. So away we go, guys. Scan the QR code. Let's get going. We've got 49 of you in right now. I will give it another minute while you all get logged in, and we will get onto the Q&A. Actually, I see some questions in the Q&A. Hopefully they're being dealt with as well.
Yep. Team's got most of those.
Okay, we'll just give it another minute or so, get more people in, see when we start to stabilize. So we're at 57. Okay, maybe 30 seconds. How many people got 106? So participation is pretty good, 60 people. Okay, team, we are going to go. We are going to get started. Okay. Yes. Excellent. So this is great news. So 56 players, we lost a couple, but we are ready to go with question 1. If you are ready, we're going to start. Faster to get more points. What does IoT stand for? Hey, interest of technology. That is definitely true.
I like that one.
Yeah, intelligent operating technology, Internet of Things, and Internetwork of Technology. It's a good question.
You didn't put idiot of technology in there. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. 54 of you getting that one correct. Well done, team. Good work. Let's say, moving on. So let's see how this affects the leaderboard. It's tight at the top, 2 points in it, 3 points cover the top three. So there's a few of you went pretty quick on that. Bell, we're gonna try and find you if you're still in third place at the end of this. Okay, moving on to question 2. Are you ready? Okay, what version of PAN-OS introduced device ID? 9.1, 10.2, 10.1, or 10.0? No, you got to be paying attention to call that. Tough questions, David. All right, 25 of you getting that one right. So either you've got experience or you really paid attention to David, which is awesome. So well done, team. Okay, how does that affect the leaderboard?
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun. Oh, 1 point at the top.
Oh, here we go.
So Ian McLaren, Stelios second, Michael Wright in third, but there is not a lot between it. 9 points separates the top three. This is really going to be interesting towards the end. Good to see some familiar names as well in there as well. Okay, question 3 of 5. Which logs are critical to send from the firewall to Cortex Data Lake as they're needed for IoT security? EAL, AEL, CDL, or EDL?
And for a bonus, can you define what each acronym means?
All right, good. 36 of you getting that one. EDL is obviously used in the firewall for dynamic lists, but
that is external dynamic lists, just to clarify. CDL, Cortex Data Lake, and not sure what an AEL is, but
I made that one up.
Oh, good, good. Just checking.
Yeah, that's cool. But yeah, 3 out of the 4 are used actually in the firewall, just differently. All right, congratulations to 36 of you. So let's move on. Let's look at the chart.
Oh, what we got? Oh, Michael might have been faster on that one. So,
Michael's taking top spot. Quite a gap forming now, although we have a joint second, which is interesting. Frederick and Stelios. And then I'm bringing up the 4th place. Oh, let's hope we don't need a tiebreaker. We don't have one. Okay, question 4. Are we ready to go acutely aware it's just hit the top of the hour? Okay, if you just use a tap connection on a PANW firewall to get a view into IoT only information and activity, what will you lose with IoT security? Is it visibility, capability, enforcement, or inspection?
That font's awfully small.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, 31 of you getting that one correct. You will keep your visibility. You can see all the traffic and you can inspect all the traffic. You just can do not a lot with it because you can't enforce if you're not in line. So that's 31 of you getting that one correct. Let's see who got there quickest.
But it's a good start, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Start with visibility, right? You can do a lot with that, even if you're just updating your CMDB. It's a great thing.
Oh.
So Michael Wright going top.
Oh, and Sarah coming up for second.
Oh, that came out of nowhere, Sarah. Great job. And then Frederick in third. All right. Last question. Question 5. Okay, what version of PAN-OS introduced DHCP Syslog Visibility? 10, 11, 10.1, 10.2.
David, that's a hard question.
It's a horrible question.
I know.
This is definitely going to weed them out because I wasn't paying that close attention to recall.
All right, 25 of you correct on that one. It was 11.0. This is the ability to stream your syslog from DHCP into the firewall, where it will pass the log, wrap it in an EL, and stream it to the IoT subscription.
We're going to hold the results to next week.
We are going to hold the results for next week, so we like to tease. But thank you, team, for pulling this together. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We appreciate you spending your time with us. We know your time is precious. Please complete the survey. Your feedback's a gift. We want to hear more from you. And I look forward to the final session next week with Julian talking about zero trust and how we're going to bring all of this together. So look, thank you ever so much. And thank you for your patience staying on a little bit longer. We've run late, but we shall speak to you next week. Thank you, guys. Thank you, team.
Thanks.